It had been a quiet evening. The soft hum of the television played in the background as my husband David and I sat in the living room, each lost in our own thoughts. I had been distracted all day, ever since our new neighbor, Ethan, had moved in across the street. There was something about him that was hard to ignore. He was younger than us, in his mid-30s, with a confident air that seemed to draw attention without him even trying. I had noticed the way he looked at me the day he introduced himself, a flicker of something in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. But what unnerved me more was the way David had brought him up in conversation that evening. It had been casual at first, a comment about how we should be friendly and welcome him to the neighborhood. But as the conversation went on, David's tone had shifted, becoming more suggestive in ways I hadn't expected. "You know, you should go over there sometime," David had said, his voice low, almost teasing. "Get to know him better." I had laughed it off at first, assuming he was just joking. But the look in his eyes told me otherwise. There was something beneath his words, something I couldn't quite place. "David, what are you talking about?" I had asked, half laughing, trying to brush off the strange suggestion. He leaned back on the couch, his eyes studying me in a way that made me uncomfortable. "I'm serious. He's new in town, probably doesn't know many people yet. Why not? Make him feel welcome." There it was again, that edge in his voice. My heart began to race, but not in the way it usually did when David teased me. This felt different. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake off the unease that was slowly settling in. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, my voice quieter now. David tilted his head slightly, a small smile playing on his lips. "Why not? You're a beautiful woman. I'm sure he wouldn't mind the company." His words sent a shock through me, and I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. Was he actually suggesting what I thought he was? The idea seemed absurd, but the way David was looking at me, the way his words lingered in the air, made it impossible to dismiss. "You can't be serious," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. David's smile widened, and he reached out to take my hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I've been thinking about it for a while," he said softly, "about how things might be, different for us, more exciting." My heart was pounding now, a mixture of confusion, fear, and something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I pulled my hand away, standing up from the couch, needing to put some distance between us. "David, this is crazy," I said, shaking my head. "We're married. I don't understand what you're trying to say." He stood up as well, closing the distance between us. His hand reached for mine again, and this time I didn't pull away. His eyes were intense, filled with a desire I hadn't seen in a long time. "I'm saying I trust you," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "I trust you to explore something new, something different, and I think Ethan might be a part of that." My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my mind racing. Was David really suggesting this? Was he serious about me? With Ethan? The thought was too wild, too insane to even consider. And yet, the way he was looking at me, the way his words seemed so calm, so calculated, made me realize he had thought about this for a long time. I turned away, wrapping my arms around myself as if to protect myself from the idea that was slowly forming in my mind. Ethan, our new neighbor, handsome, confident, and now the subject of a conversation I never imagined having with my husband. "I don't think I can do this," I said softly, my voice trembling. David stepped closer, his hands resting on my shoulders as he leaned down to whisper in my ear. "You can, Kate. I know you can. I wouldn't ask if I didn't trust you. And, you know, you've been thinking about it too." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I closed my eyes, trying to block out the rush of emotions flooding through me. Guilt, confusion, and desire. I hated to admit it, but he wasn't entirely wrong. There was something about Ethan that had caught my attention the moment I met him, but that didn't mean I was ready to act on it. "I can't," I whispered, shaking my head. "I'm your wife. This isn't right." David's hands tightened on my shoulders, and I could feel the tension in his body, the intensity of his words as they poured into my ear. "I know you, Kate. I know what you want. And this is something we both want. You're not betraying me. You're doing this for us." David's words echoed in my mind even after he stepped away, leaving me standing there in the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. "For us," he had said, but how could something like this be for us? How could something that felt so wrong, so taboo, be a part of our marriage? I couldn't wrap my head around it, and yet, a part of me was drawn to the idea, despite how much I wanted to resist. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, replaying everything David had said, the way he had looked at me, and the strange, undeniable attraction I felt toward Ethan. I had been trying to ignore it since we first met, telling myself it was nothing more than a fleeting thought, something that would pass. But now, with David's words stirring everything up, I couldn't push it aside any longer. By morning, I had convinced myself that it was just a fantasy something David had concocted in a moment of madness. It wasn't real. It didn't have to be real. We would move past this, and everything would go back to normal. But as the day went on, I noticed the way David looked at me, the way his eyes followed me as if he was waiting for something, waiting for me to make a move I wasn't ready to make. It wasn't until later that afternoon when I was in the kitchen washing dishes that David brought it up again. He came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. "Have you thought about what I said?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, my hands stilling in the soapy water, my heart skipping a beat. I had thought about it. I had thought about nothing else. But I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know how to tell him that the idea scared me, that it made me feel things I wasn't ready to admit to myself, let alone to him. "David," I started, but the words caught in my throat. He pressed a soft kiss to my neck, his breath warm against my skin. "I just want you to be happy," he murmured. "I want us to be happy. Don't you trust me?" His words tugged at something deep inside me, and I found myself leaning back into him, my body betraying the turmoil in my mind. Did I trust him? Of course I did. We had built a life together, shared everything, but this was something I had never expected. And yet, the way he was holding me, the way his voice soothed my frayed nerves, made me want to believe him, made me want to trust him, even in this. "I don't know if I can do this," I whispered, my voice trembling with uncertainty. David's grip around my waist tightened slightly, and I could feel his heart beating against my back. "I know it's a lot," he said gently, "but you don't have to decide right now. Just think about it, and if you want to, I'll be right here supporting you, always." He kissed my neck again, and I closed my eyes, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside me. It was insane. It was reckless. But the way he was speaking, the way he was making it seem like it was about us, not just me, made it harder to resist. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and tension. I avoided Ethan as much as I could, unsure of how to even look at him, knowing what David had asked of me. But it seemed that fate had other plans. One evening, I was out in the front yard, watering the plants, when Ethan came over, waving with that charming smile that had caught my attention the first day we met. He was holding a bottle of wine, a casual invitation in his posture as he approached. "Hey Kate," he called out, his voice warm and friendly. "I was wondering if you and David might want to join me for a drink later. I just finished unpacking and thought it'd be a nice way to celebrate finally being settled in." My heart leaped into my throat, and I stood there frozen for a moment, unsure of what to say. I glanced back at the house, half expecting David to appear, but he didn't. I was alone, standing there with Ethan, the weight of David's request hanging over me like a dark cloud. I don't know," I stammered, my mind racing. Ethan smiled, that easy, confident smile that made my pulse quicken despite myself. "It's no pressure," he said, holding up the bottle. "Just thought it'd be nice to unwind with some neighbors. Let me know if you change your mind." He turned to leave, but something in me stirred, something that I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, so casual, so sure of himself. Or maybe it was the way David's words kept playing in my head, his suggestion lingering like a secret that I couldn't keep locked away. "Wait," I called out before I could stop myself. Ethan turned back, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "Yeah." I swallowed hard, my heart racing as I forced the words out. "David's not home, but I could come over for a bit." Ethan's smile widened, and I could feel the tension building between us, the unspoken attraction that I had been trying so hard to ignore. "Sounds great," he said, his voice low and inviting. "I'll get things set up." I stood there for a moment after he walked away, my mind reeling from what I had just done. What was I thinking? I should have said no, I should have stayed inside. But now, I was committed. And the thought of what might happen next sent a rush of adrenaline through me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the watering can still in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. What had I just agreed to? The reality of it hit me like a tidal wave. I was going to go over to Ethan's house alone. This wasn't just a neighborly visit. I knew it, and deep down, I knew that Ethan likely did too. The weight of David's words from days ago hung over me, filling me with a mix of guilt and anticipation that I couldn't shake. After a few minutes, I made my way inside the house, my hands trembling as I placed the watering can back on the counter. I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror, my face flushed, my lips parted slightly, my eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Excitement? A little bit of both? I couldn't tell. I needed to calm down. I needed to think. But as I stood there staring at my reflection, the only thing I could think about was Ethan, his easy smile, his confidence, the way he had looked at me from across the street. My mind flashed back to the conversation with David. He had said he trusted me, that this was something we could explore together, something that would be for us. But was it really? Or was this something that was about to tear everything apart? Before I could second-guess myself any further, I found myself heading toward the door, my feet moving on their own. I wasn't sure what I was walking into, but the pull was too strong to ignore. I stepped outside, the cool evening air doing little to calm the storm inside me, and made my way across the street to Ethan's house. As I approached his front door, my heart raced. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorbell, wondering if I should turn back. But something deep inside pushed me forward, and before I knew it, I pressed the button. The sound of the doorbell echoed inside, and within seconds the door swung open. Ethan stood there, looking relaxed, holding 2 glasses of wine. He grinned at me, the kind of grin that sent a rush of warmth through me despite my nervousness. "Kate, you made it," he said, his voice low and inviting. "Come on in." I stepped inside, my heart still pounding, the familiar scent of wood and spices filling the air. His house was neat, warm, inviting. But I could feel the tension building between us, the unspoken understanding that this wasn't just a casual drink. There was something more here, something I wasn't sure I was ready for but couldn't walk away from. "Red or white?" Ethan asked, handing me a glass of wine as he gestured for me to sit down on the couch. "White," I replied, my voice a little shaky, but I managed to smile. I took the glass from him, our fingers brushing slightly in the exchange, sending a jolt through me that I hadn't expected. Ethan sat down next to me, a little closer than I had anticipated, and I could feel the heat of his body radiating toward me, making it hard to focus on anything but him. We sipped our wine in silence for a moment, and I could feel his eyes on me, studying me. My nerves were on edge, but beneath the anxiety there was something else, a spark, a curiosity I hadn't felt in a long time. "So," Ethan said, breaking the silence, his voice smooth and steady, "how are you settling into the neighborhood?" I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, relieved by the small talk. "It's been good," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. "Everyone's been really friendly." He nodded, taking another sip of his wine. "I bet David's been keeping you busy." At the mention of David, my stomach twisted. The weight of what I was doing hit me all over again. This was wrong. I knew it was wrong. But David had asked me to do this. He had put the idea in my head, planted the seed that had grown into this moment. And now, here I was, sitting in our new neighbor's house, feeling things I shouldn't be feeling. "Yeah," I said softly, my mind spinning. "David's been supportive." Ethan raised an eyebrow, sensing the hesitation in my voice. "Supportive? Ha," he leaned in slightly, his knee brushing against mine. "You don't sound too sure about that." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. There was no going back now. I was here, and whatever was about to happen, I couldn't pretend that I hadn't been a part of it. "He's open to things," I said carefully, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's eyes darkened, and I could see the shift in him, the realization of what I was really saying. He set his glass down on the table, leaning in closer to me, his hand resting gently on my knee. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a wave of heat through me that I couldn't ignore. "And what about you, Kate?" he asked, his voice low and intimate. "Are you open to things?" My breath hitched in my throat, and I looked up at him, the space between us shrinking with each passing second. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped this before it went any further. But instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, my body betraying the conflict raging inside me. "I don't know," I whispered, though we both knew that wasn't true. I knew exactly what I wanted in that moment, no matter how wrong it was. Ethan's hand slid up my thigh, his fingers brushing against my skin in a way that made my heart race even faster. He was so close now, his breath warm against my neck, and I could feel the tension between us reaching a breaking point. "You can tell me to stop," he murmured, his lips just inches from mine. "But I don't think you want me to." And he was right. I didn't want him to stop. Not anymore. His words lingered in the air, thick with promise, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, the pounding of my heart in my chest like a drumbeat. Ethan's hand on my thigh was a gentle pressure, but it felt like fire against my skin, spreading warmth through every inch of me. I knew this was wrong, everything about it was wrong, but I couldn't find it in me to care anymore. Slowly, Ethan closed the small distance between us, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss so soft, so tentative, that it left me breathless. My whole body tensed for a moment, caught in the swirling storm of guilt and desire, but then I let go. I let myself sink into the moment, into the warmth of his kiss, the way his hands seemed to know exactly where to touch me to make me feel like I was floating. I kissed him back, my hands finding their way to his shoulders, pulling him closer. The wine glass I had been holding slipped from my fingers and landed softly on the carpet, but I barely registered the sound. Everything faded away, the room, the house, the world outside, until there was only Ethan and the way he made me feel. His lips moved against mine with a hunger that matched my own, and before I knew it, we were lost in each other, the tension that had been simmering between us for days finally breaking free. His hands slid up my arms, over my shoulders, and then down to my waist, pulling me onto his lap. I could feel the heat of his body against mine, the way his breath hitched as I kissed him deeper, and it only fueled the fire burning inside me. I had never felt anything like this before, a raw, electric connection that seemed to hum in the air around us, pulling us closer and closer and closer and closer until there was nothing left between us. I didn't stop to think. I didn't let myself remember that I was married, that this was supposed to be wrong. All I could focus on was the way Ethan's hands felt on my body, the way his lips moved against mine with a desperation that mirrored my own. It was like we had both been waiting for this, like we had been building up to this moment for longer than either of us realized. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, the room seemed to tilt, and I rested my forehead against his, my heart racing. For a moment we just sat there, tangled together on his couch, the air between us thick with the aftermath of what we had just done. I could feel the weight of it settling over me like a heavy blanket, the guilt, the confusion, the realization that this was real, that we had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. I started, but the words caught in my throat. What could I possibly say? How could I explain the whirlwind of emotions crashing over me in that moment? Ethan gently cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing softly over my cheeks. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "I know." But that only made it worse. He understood. He knew exactly what this was, what we had done, and yet he wasn't pulling away. And neither was I. I slid off his lap, sitting back down beside him on the couch, my heart still pounding as I tried to gather my thoughts. The weight of what had just happened began to settle over me like a suffocating fog. I had crossed a line. I had done exactly what David had asked of me, and now I didn't know what that meant for me, for David, or for Ethan. Ethan reached for my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his eyes filled with concern. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was telling the truth. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I didn't expect this." He smiled, a small, understanding smile. Neither did I. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, the weight of what had just happened hanging between us. I could feel the tension easing, but the guilt that gnawed at me was impossible to ignore. What had I done? How was I supposed to face David after this? "I should go," I said softly, standing up, my legs shaky beneath me. "I need to figure this out." Ethan stood too, his eyes soft but serious. "Of course," he said, stepping closer. "Just take your time. You don't have to make any decisions right now." I gave him a weak smile, appreciating his words, but knowing that the weight of what had happened wouldn't disappear so easily. I thanked him for the wine, for the company, and with one last look, I left his house, my mind spinning with everything that had just unfolded. As I walked back across the street, the cool night air did little to calm my racing thoughts. What would I say to David? How would I explain what had happened? I felt like I had betrayed him, but at the same time, wasn't this exactly what he had asked of me? Hadn't he put me in this impossible situation? When I walked back into my house, the silence was overwhelming. I sat down on the couch, my hands trembling as I stared at the spot where David and I had talked just days ago. I didn't know how I was going to move forward from this. I didn't know what this meant for my marriage, for my life. That night, I barely slept. My mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, guilt, desire, confusion. I couldn't shake the memory of Ethan's touch, the way he had made me feel. But I also couldn't ignore the guilt that weighed heavily on my chest, the feeling that I had done something that couldn't be undone. The next morning, David noticed the change in me. He could see the tension in my body, the way I couldn't meet his eyes, and I knew that he knew something had happened. "Kate," he said softly, sitting down beside me on the couch, Did you see Ethan?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. David didn't say anything for a long time. He just sat there watching me, his expression unreadable. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he reached out and took my hand. "I told you," he said quietly, his voice calm. "I trust you." But the truth was, I wasn't sure if I trusted myself anymore.